as a Christian, I think that truth is important. And I have great confidence that that's the best way to protect the brand, is not covering things up. It's being honest, it's being transparent, it's owning our own faults, and it's, again, getting the story right. So I didn't actually think I was being all that brave when I wrote this book. I've been told by more than one person, you are so brave because you named names.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom on this splendid September afternoon. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're continuing our Search for Meaning series. We're examining the benefits and failures of mainstream religion in America. Today it's the turn of the white evangelical church to go under the microscope. Our guest speaker is Dr. Kristin Du Mez, whose book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, shot up to number 4 in the New York Times bestseller list this summer. Du Mez is a professor of history at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she'll be joined by 2 great thinkers and historians of religion. John Butler is Professor Emeritus of American Studies, History, and Religious Studies at Yale. His latest book is God in Gotham, The Miracle of Religion in Modern Manhattan, and he joins us from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Dr. Jemar Tisby is an author and historian and an expert on the Black evangelical church. He's written the New York Times bestseller, The Color of Compromise, and his second book, How to Fight Racism, was published on January the 5th, 2021, the day before the insurrection in DC. Tisby is founder of The Witness, Inc. and co-host of Pass the Mic podcast. He joins us from the Arkansas Delta. So welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us from 3 different states and 2 different time zones. Very good of you. So let's kick off. Jesus and John Wayne, an unexpected bestseller. Du Mez diligently traces how over several decades, a militant ideal of white Christian manhood has come to pervade evangelical popular culture in the United States. She delves into the hypocrisy and disconnect between purported Christian ethics and the rise of sexual abuse, corruption, and scandal within the evangelical church. Her research shows how American evangelicals have replaced the idea of Jesus of the Gospels with an idol of rugged, militant Christian masculinity, as one chaplain puts it, a spiritual badass. This shift culminated in the hero worship of Trump, who embodied the idea of protector and warrior, even if by doing this, it meant that many followers betrayed their own moral values. So, John, welcome. Let's start with you. You said you were blown away by the research in Kristin's book, that there had always been evangelical crackpots, but after reading the book, you realized that this was not a peripheral thing, but central to the church.
That's right. When I first got the book, I thought, wow, what a title. It seemed a little glossy, a little, whatever. And I started reading, and by the time I was on page 10, I thought, this is not your standard account of the nature of evangelicalism. It's not your standard account of much that we say about American religion and why. So the book is important for 2 things. One is it's really bracing account of evangelicals and the presidential election that Donald Trump narrowly won. But it's also for people like me and for people who think about post-World War II evangelicalism generally, which means born again American Protestantism. That's the big thing about evangelicals. We've generally thought of them as somewhat, Jerry Falwell and others aside, we've generally thought of them as quiet, positive, largely positive, sweet, whatever. And, here's a book about, look at the title, Jesus and John Wayne. What's John Wayne doing in this history? Well, you're right. The way you described it is absolutely correct. It's a book about macho behavior. It's a book about men It's a book about male authority and the suppression of the role of women in significant roles in many evangelical congregations. It's a book about race prejudice. Sometimes we keep forgetting that Jerry Falwell once gave a big sermon on segregation forever. And he criticized Christian ministers, white or black, who were agitating for civil rights. And this came out of his born again views. So this is why, and what she really describes is a movement in which this is of primary importance. And that's why she says at the end, evangelicals didn't betray their faith. They really fulfilled it by voting for Donald Trump. And that, of course, has set people off. Many, you can well imagine that not everybody is happy about this particular, about Kristin's point of view.
So for people that aren't within that church and aren't knowledgeable about the ins and outs, from the outside, they purport to be moral Christians. So I could never square, and I don't think a lot of people could, Trump's appalling behavior and language with him being some kind of representative of good living and vote for him. This is something I can't really understand, John. How do people hold those?
Well, it is hard to understand. But as Kristin describes, evangelicals, particularly male evangelicals, have long been fascinated by macho behavior. That's why they were very early taken by John Wayne. And John Wayne was Donald Trump, the younger Donald Trump. There's nothing in John Wayne's life that was much different than Trump's life. Women, money, questionable behavior, race prejudice. He openly said that he believed in white supremacy. Trump won't actually say that, whatever, but he acts it out. Okay, but John Wayne, why would an evangelical be? They just pass that by. And there's something else here, and that is that there is a strain within evangelicalism that says that, well, we're all imperfect. We are imperfect beings, and God sometimes chooses. God has to choose. God doesn't have any choice. God has to choose imperfect beings to forward true principles. So the people who forward these principles are themselves wounded, imperfect, maybe they're even disgusting, but they forward these views. And what views do they want? They want militarism. They want dominance of men. They want a white society. Well, that's so. Therefore, excusing Trump isn't much different than excusing John Wayne. Or think of it differently: a whole series of major evangelical male figures were accused, rightly so, demonstrably so, of sexual harassment and behavior, having relationships with people outside their own marriage. And one evangelical leader after another passed that by. One of them volunteered to preach in the church of one of the accused ministers, and that is John Piper, who happens to be from Minneapolis, where I live. And without the slightest bit of shame. So they had passed this. So when this famous tapes came out about Trump's conversation on the bus, whatever. Evangelicals could really say, well, so what? It's just more talk, and they already passed by on the behavior. So it's a strained capacity.
Okay, so just looking at the political spectrum for a moment, we went from having a very educated, truly Christian man in the White House, Obama, from him to Trump. Now, a lot of people in the rest of the world said, how was that possible? Weren't we on a positive trajectory? Weren't we progressing as a nation? And then we took this enormous jump back. Is that how you see it?
The way you put it is interesting, because many evangelicals never accepted the notion that Barack Obama was a true educated Christian. Many evangelicals stuck with the notion that he was really a Muslim in disguise. And that's a standard fare in many both right-wing and certain evangelical circles, and they couldn't get that out of their system. So also remember if I may say, the job that was done on Obama by right-wing, often evangelical speakers over 8 long years of undermining the authority of this Black president consistently. Mitch McConnell said it was his task to destroy the Obama presidency. Well, he was speaking from a political point of view. These other people, too many evangelicals are speaking from a religious point of view. They really needed to get him out. And they organized, they campaigned, some quietly, some vociferously. And that helps explain why it is you had this giant block of voters, religiously inclined, who are going to flock to the polls in 2016 and vote for Donald Trump, even though he was a damaged man, but he forwarded God's right view of the world.
Okay, Kristin, welcome. Thank you for writing such a brave book. I say this because you are a Christian and the daughter of a Reformed Christian minister yourself. So you're not going to win any converts to the church with this book, are you? So why was it so important for you to write the truth rather than protect the brand?
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for hosting, and thank you also to Dr. Butler and Dr. Tisby for joining us here today. Yes, I didn't set out to write this book to win converts to anything. I didn't have any thoughts really about protecting the brand. I am a Christian. I've always had kind of one foot in the evangelical world and one foot out. Because I'm part of a Dutch immigrant family tradition. And so I've kind of been immersed in the popular culture of evangelicalism, listening to Christian music, shopping in Christian bookstores growing up. But I still had a kind of independent perspective as well. So I'm kind of on the edges there. But more importantly, I wrote this book as a work of history. And I really wanted to get the story right. That's what I was after. I didn't give much thought to whether people would like evangelicals more or less. That really didn't enter into my thinking at all. More importantly, though, I would say that as a Christian, I think that truth is important. And I have great confidence that that's the best way to protect a brand, is not covering things up. It's being honest. It's being transparent. It's owning our own faults. And it's, again, getting the story right. So I didn't actually think I was being all that brave when I wrote this book. I've been told by more than one person, you are so brave because you named names. And that struck me as a very odd comment, because again, I'm a historian. I don't know how you write history if you don't name names. And at the same time, I will say that I would push back a little bit against the idea out there, maybe that, you're not going to win any converts through this book, because unexpectedly, the book has received an enormously positive reception among many white evangelicals, including conservative white evangelicals, who see the truth as in it. And I've heard from hundreds, actually probably thousands by now, who have written to me, who have reached out to me and have thanked me for helping them to see what they have been a part of. Many of them confessing their complicity in this, and several of them also saying that in some ways this saved their faith by being able to name this and by being able to have somebody who is a Christian call this out as well.
So this concept of rugged Christian masculinity and nationalism, as you mentioned, and you talk about Theodore Roosevelt's ideas, it's not new, but it's not biblical, is it?
Well, it depends which part of the Bible you want to look at, I suppose, right? You can find, Jesus turning over the tables in the temple. You can find some militant imagery in the book of Revelation. And I know this because the people I write about, these are their favorite passages. But you also find a lot of teachings in the scriptures that undercut this sort of militancy, right? The idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, and loving your enemies, even turning the other cheek, the whole kind of model of Jesus Christ in the New Testament of really a model that is countercultural. He wasn't the Messiah that his followers had expected him to be, right? He wasn't going to lead them into their in their battles. Instead, he was the suffering servant. He divested himself of power. So as I understand Christianity, again, you can look to the Bible and you can find a lot of different stories there. There's a lot of different verses in the Bible that you can kind of pick and choose from. But the overarching theme, as I understand it, is one that is really kind of countercultural and one of not grasping for power, not this kind of coercive power, but one of divesting of power. And that's certainly gave me a kind of critical frame where I could hold up and critique this kind of ideology that ended up embracing bringing in a lot of cultural ideals, a lot of secular ideals, right? It's no coincidence that evangelicals, when they were looking to their to find heroes, that they looked to men who were not shaped by traditional Christian virtues, right? To men like John Wayne. I could just as easily have called this book Jesus and Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, right? That I really tried to find a way to make that fit in a title. But they were looking outside of Christian tradition because the Christian virtues of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, there's a conflict there with a kind of rugged militant masculinity, with militarism. And so again, no surprise that they would find these heroes outside of their faith tradition, men like Donald Trump even, and then hold them up as these are the men that God has especially equipped to do what needs to be done. And they can be ruthless for the sake of righteousness.
And historically, you went back quite a few decades to look at the origins of this, correct?
Yes.
So it's not something new. I think that's what I was trying to understand.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can.
Repackaged.
Well, it is. History is always about continuity and change, right? So you can certainly find elements of a more militant, rugged masculinity, and we can talk about Teddy Roosevelt. But in the early 20th century as well, there were differences too. In the case of the First World War, for example, many conservative Protestants were pacifists. Many liberal Protestants were Christian nationalists, and you also saw in the early 20th century a number of liberal Protestants really embraced this rugged, muscular Christianity, as you saw conservatives as well. So things just aligned in different ways. It's really in the 1940s, particularly the late 40s and the early Cold War era, where we start to see this conservative Protestants really embrace a constellation of ideals. So you have gender traditionalism, right, patriarchy and female submission, and Christian nationalism, really defending Christian America, and anti-communism. And so this defending Christian America is you defend the faith, and they understood themselves to be the most faithful of all Christians, and you defend Christian America. And in the Cold War, that was a military defense. So it's really in the 1940s and 1950s that you see these values really come together.
So at some point you mentioned to me that your students introduced you to this book, which was quite kind of a radical, you were shocked by it in some ways. John Eldredge's book, Wild at Heart.
Yeah.
And he says, God is a warrior, God and every man is made in his image. Well, clearly he didn't mean every man, he meant white men. And was he in fact giving tacit permission here to embrace militarism and misogyny, in your view?
Yeah, Eldredge is an interesting figure. He hasn't weighed in on Jesus and John Wayne, nor has he really stepped back from any of his writing. So I can't really speak to his intentions. But yes, his book was extremely influential. It went on to sell more than 4 million copies. So in the early 2000s, it was published in 2001, just months before the September 11 attacks, and that really kind of amplified its message. But it was everywhere on Christian college campuses, in evangelical churches. My own church was hosting book clubs on it. All the guys in the dorms across this country and Christian dorms are reading this book. They actually had Braveheart dorms that were christened, and it was really, really a thing. And it did. I noticed a couple of things right up front. Yes, I was shocked by this militancy. Every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. It was so highly gendered. And as a woman reading this, like, wait a minute. Where's my role here? My role was to share in a man's adventure and to be seductive and to kind of support a man's role. You can see this is all. It struck me as very problematic at the time and in subsequent years as well. But then, yes, there's a question of race. And what I noticed very early on, Eldredge does not limit this to white men only, not explicitly at all. But when I started to pay attention to, in the early 2000s, the success of Eldredge's book fueled this kind of cottage industry of copycat books. They were a dime a dozen. And the ones that weren't selling great were still selling over 100,000 copies, right? This was a really big thing. And what I noticed that all of the heroes, they loved their heroes. They were all the same cast of characters: Theodore Roosevelt, William Wallace, right? John Wayne was popping up, General Patton, General MacArthur. I realized at a certain point, these are all white guys. And not only were they white guys, but they were white men, the majority of whom kind of proved their heroic masculinity by subduing non-white populations. So take Teddy Roosevelt, for example. Look at nearly every movie John Wayne starred in, right? He's the hero who is going to bring order through violence. And, he needs to subdue the Native Americans, the Mexicans, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, and this is the motif. And so I started to take that seriously and look at how this was being deployed, who was included and who was excluded from this. And very early on in my research, I realized I'd set out to write a book about gender, and it turned into a book about gender and also very much a book about race.
So let's go back to fall 2016 for a moment, when we all saw that awful tape from Access Hollywood. So when I saw that, I thought, that's it. He's done. Great. What a way to go. And of course, the converse occurred. The reporter got fired, but people couldn't seem to get enough of him, including women. So was this a watershed moment for you, Kristin?
It was. I think for so many of us. In 2016, I had actually been working on a project exploring the religious history of Hillary Clinton, and I had been watching very closely as kind of the response among different folks to her campaign. Particularly, I was watching white evangelicals, and it was not very positive, if you recall. So I was watching very closely, but from that angle. And I saw already in 2015, in August of 2015, we had the first surveys coming out pointing to this grassroots support for Donald Trump among white evangelicals. Before any of the big name leaders were on board, we were seeing this in the survey data. And so I was watching that very closely for the next year, and just watching that groundswell. Eventually leaders came on board, and by fall of 2016, it was striking. And then we had the Access Hollywood tape. And yes, we all kind of held our breath. What's going to happen now? Surely this is too far. And, we had a couple of evangelical leaders ever so briefly waver. And then they prayed about it and were right back on board within the week. And that's when it did really strike me. That it was in that moment that this previous research, I had started researching evangelical masculinity back in the early 2000s, back when my students had brought me John Eldredge's book. I spent over a year researching evangelical masculinity and militarism. And then I had to finish another book, and I had 3 kids, and I just always meant to come back to it. But then I was distracted, and I was working on this Clinton project. And it was in those days after the Access Hollywood tape release that all of a sudden that old research came back to me. And I realized that the language that I was hearing evangelical leaders use to justify their support for Donald Trump was exactly the same language that I had encountered in this literature, 15 years earlier, that we need we need a warrior. Right, evangelicals were saying around 2016, he's our ultimate fighting champion. We need a man who will do what needs to be done, not somebody who's cowed by political correctness or gentleness or any of these things. And all of a sudden, this research came back to me, and it was this daunting moment where I thought, I think I know what might happen here. And it was really in the after, of course, the election. That's when I thought, yes, I need to do this. I dusted off that old research, and that's really the origins of Jesus and John Wayne.
So talking about the internal corruption going on in the evangelical church, in June of this year, The Atlantic wrote a very interesting piece entitled "Scandal Rocking the Evangelical World." And it really dealt with the very public departure of Russell Moore from the Southern Baptist Convention, which they said shook the Christian world. Well, for those who don't know, Moore was president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the policy arm of SBC, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. And Russell had been quite an influential critic of Trump and influential evangelical. And he'd written about his disgust at the sexual abuse within the church and the lack of racial reconciliation. He'd written about that. So do you think he triggered many other people to follow or no? So I'll ask you first, Kristin.
Yeah, I don't think he did trigger people to follow. I think in some ways he was following others who had already left. But he was certainly, extremely high profile defector. He and Beth Moore in particular, they really caught the national media attention, and they certainly caught attention within the evangelical world. Kind of two of the most prominent Southern Baptists, two of the most prominent evangelicals in this country, really, who said enough is enough. And so what we're seeing is this kind of new divide. The old alliances are kind of breaking down and new boundaries are being drawn. I was watching both Beth Moore and Russell Moore so closely when I was writing Jesus and John Wayne. So as a historian, I'm used to actually writing about people who are dead. And so this book kind of stretched me up into the present, literally like to the moment. And so as I was writing, I was watching this play out in real time. And I kept wondering, what is Beth Moore? What would she think of what I'm writing? Because I think I can explain her situation a little bit. Same thing with Russell Moore. Like, I see what's happening here, and they are in the thick of it, where for a long time, I think these differences aren't new within white evangelicalism, but these differences that are now impossible to ignore, the kind of pro-Trump, anti-Trump factions, had been papered over for a really long time with niceties, with using the same language, the same, claiming the same theology, claiming that we have unity in Christ. And in fact, a lot of people kind of bumped up against these boundaries for decades, really. And people have been quietly leaving evangelical spaces or being forced out of evangelical spaces for a very long time. I think that Jemar could speak eloquently to this, what this was like as for many Black Christians who found themselves in white evangelical spaces, who are deeply committed to working on this racial reconciliation project and spent years, if not decades of their lives. And at various times, eventually said, this isn't working. It's not worth it. Folks who experienced in local settings cases of abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, many of the survivors were the ones who ended up being pushed out of their communities, pushed out of their churches, as people circled the wagons and protected the pastors, the perpetrators. And then we can talk about LGBTQ folks as well, right, who wanted a space within this tradition, and many of them were also excluded. So a lot of people have been leaving, but then to have two figureheads, white evangelical leaders themselves, no longer finding a home. I mean, that has been remarkable. Did they motivate more people to leave? I don't think so. I think everybody's situation is it's local. And so people have been leaving before, people are leaving now. I hear from many people who are trying to change the course of their institutions, of their churches, of their Christian schools, their colleges. They are inspired to bring change, to work for justice. And 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 out of 100, they get stymied. They run into the power brokers in these organizations, in these institutions, and they're the ones who end up leaving. So I don't know that Russell Moore inspired people to leave. I think he's representative of a pattern that's happening across American evangelicalism.
Okay, so I am going to come to Jemar. Thomas Kidd, who is a historian at Baylor University, said, in American pop culture parlance, evangelical now basically means whites who consider themselves religious and who vote Republican. Jemar, as a religious scholar and a Black social activist, how do you react to this definition? Is it accurate?
I think it's largely accurate and it's not new. I think I would agree with Dr. Du Mez going all the way back to the 40s and the 50s, the rise of the Cold War and anti-communism. You really had the beginnings of this modern coalescing between a religious expression we call evangelicalism and right-leaning or even far-right political ideologies. I do think it's important to mention that evangelical has very different meanings in different contexts, particularly outside of the United States. So as I correspond with Christians in Central and South America, evangelical has a very different history and connotation and even political definition, namely because of some contrast with Catholicism and the history there. So when we are having this conversation, I think while in some senses evangelicalism and certainly Christianity is a global project for sure, there's a lot that is very specific to the US context. And so going back to the original definition, this coalescing, this alignment has been happening for decades. And I think what Trump did was not create much new, but highlight what was there in sort of undeniable terms, because you really did have very clear choices, right? Whether Democrat or Republican, whether for Trump or for someone else. And once those, very clear binary choices emerged, and you saw in 2016, for instance, 4 out of 5 people who self-identified as white evangelicals and who voted pulling the lever for Trump, then you have a pretty clear picture of where people stand, what they stand for. And I think that was sort of the lightning in a bottle that Dr. Du Mez's book captured. She's just being a faithful historian and has incredibly perceptive insights about continuity and discontinuity and linking the pieces together. But I think for a lot of people, what it did was help them make sense of how could people who were were trumpeting moral values and ethics so much vote for a man like Trump, who pretty much exhibited the opposite of everything they claimed to cherish. And so I think she was able to link the pieces together in such a way and at such a moment that it helped people realize, oh, this isn't actually a departure from what they said or practiced. This is actually the fulfillment of it.
So it's a pretty depressing indictment of evangelical religion here in the United States, which sounds like a political outfit, really at best. Do you think the answer for Black Christians, unfortunately, is to really seeking change to remain within their Black church communities? Is it safer than hoping to have an integrated vision? I mean, the church you attend, for example, it's probably 90% Black, correct?
A lot of people would assume that. It's not. And it's so funny to me because I am full-throated in my critiques of what evangelicalism has become. And yet I still maintain spiritual community with some who could be characterized as white evangelicals. I'm having conversations about mask wearing and vaccines and whether to trust the science. I'm immersed in it, even as I study it as an academic and a historian. So as far as Black Christians, we've seen this for centuries. One of the things I write in my first book, The Color of Compromise, there would be no Black church without racism in the white church. You can go all the way back to Frederick Douglass and saying, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I see the widest possible difference, right? This is not new. And as Dr. Du Mez mentioned, there's a whole bunch of patriarchy and toxic masculinity wrapped up in this. There's a whole lot of racism and white supremacy there too. I would argue that's, one of the foundational cornerstone ideologies of what evangelicalism has become, or what we would characterize as white Christian nationalism. So we've seen this up close and from afar. We've had to form our own churches, our own religious spaces as a result of it. I would say what we're seeing now is probably since about the early 90s, you had this sort of racial reconciliation movement, which was also very masculine and male centric. But you had, Black folks in earnest entering into predominantly white spaces, a lot of times because of resources, right? Like they had the programs, they had the money, they had the institutions. We entered into these spaces in good faith, believing what people said about equality and diversity and integration. And I think what has happened, that grew for a while, I'd say up until the early 2010s. And then what you get is Black people, unarmed Black people getting murdered, and it's being caught on cell phone video. And you have the advent of something like Black Lives Matter. And then you have this huge rift of people who look at incidents of Black people getting killed and they say, well, either they deserved it or that's an isolated incident. It's one bad apple. And Black people are like, no. This has been going on for a really long time. We need to do something about it. And what we saw in Christian spaces was this reticence and even opposition to move toward racial justice. And as Dr. Du Mez said, 9 times out of 10, if not 99 out of 100, when you kick against the goad in these white Christian institutions, more often than not, the people who are raising their voice in protest and in support of justice are the ones who end up getting ostracized and pushed out. And that's honestly, a large part of my own story and background.
I'm aware that we're getting lots of questions that I'm feeling it's only fair to include. So Patrick Harris says, what would you suggest for an insider in the white American evangelical world who wants to start these conversations within the tribe? How do I best use my social capital to bring this conversation to the forefront? So Jemar, do you want to try that?
So here's the thing. 2021 is not 2011. It's not, 1981. So I think what we've seen in the past 6 to 7 years, if not past decade, people are intentionally choosing where they stand on issues of racial justice, patriarchy, all of the topics that we've mentioned. It's becoming clearer and clearer. And I believe there's a sifting happening in the US church. So my first question would be, are you in a church that is Christian or white Christian nationalist? If it is white Christian nationalist, how much time and energy do you want to expend there? Because very seldom does it change. Very seldom. I'll temper that with this. Maybe you're there for a season, but I do want folks to realize seasons come and go. So maybe you're there for a season now, but that season may not last forever. And we do have the opportunity now. We've always had it, but I think we see it more clearly because of the pandemic, when we were forced outside of physically meeting in a lot of cases, to re-envision what church looks like and what community looks like and what faith communities look like. So I mean, I would do a whole lot of soul searching. Don't guilt trip yourself into staying somewhere and trying to fix it and change it. Was it Maya Angelou who said, when people show you are who they are, believe them the first time? Folks are showing who they are. And it is up to people who want to faithfully and closely follow Christ to determine whether the community they're in is the place where they can do that best. The scriptures say, that Jesus is going to build the church. The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. But that congregation is not the capital C church. And so I just say that as with a pastoral bent and with a heavy heart, knowing how much trauma and fatigue and weariness and disillusionment and bitterness results when you're trying to change a place and a people that don't want to be. Now, I'm not saying that's never, ever going to happen, but I think we need to do some deep soul searching about why we think it's only in this place or only with these people where Christ can be found or must be found in our experience.
Okay, we've got another question on similar lines from Becca Peach. There's been some debate about the preciseness, usefulness of the term evangelicalism to describe the sorts of phenomena that we've been discussing today, with some scholars starting to move toward the term Christian nationalism. To what extent are these two terms in legitimate competition with each other? And if they are, do you view the shift toward using the term Christian nationalism a helpful one? Finally, how is this dynamic complicated by the fact that Christians who supported Trump have begun to self-sort into evangelicalism? Self-sort. Okay, who wants to take that, Kristin?
Sure. That's a great set of questions there. And yes, we just saw survey data come out just a couple of days ago, right? That although we're focusing on people who have left white evangelicalism over this, more have actually joined who are identifying with this cultural and political understanding of the term evangelical, essentially, to Trump supporters. So would it be better for us to are we really not talking about evangelicalism, and should we use the more precise term white Christian nationalism? I think we can use both and in different contexts. So white Christian nationalism is really helpful to kind of name precisely this set of values that we're talking about. And so, Taking America Back for God is a great book by sociologists Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry that just give us very clear tools that we can talk about this conservative white evangelicalism. It's patriarchal, it's nationalist, racist, and all of that. I'm still talking about evangelicalism, and a huge subset of that happens to be white Christian nationalism. And often the power dynamics are such that that is the dominant strand. But I'm also talking about evangelicalism more broadly, right? As this religious movement, as a culture, as a religious subculture. And that's where things get really interesting. Because again, I'm reminded every single day that white evangelicals and that people who identify as conservative white evangelicals are reading Jesus and John Wayne, and they are my biggest proselytizers out there. They're having book clubs. They're challenging each other. And again, not the majority, so numbers here matter. But to understand that, one of the things I try to do in this book is try to get at, who are evangelicals? And I end up kind of settling on they are in many cases we can think of them as a consumer culture. So not necessarily as people who believe in particular theological doctrines, but these are people who may be exposed to this evangelical culture through a mega church. It may be through Christian radio, through Christian music, through Christian television, talk radio, all of these different things, right? And Christian publishing. Christian publishing is this massive industry. And this is what shapes the values of evangelicals. Many of them end up being drawn to conservative political values. We could say 81% of them do, but that still leaves us with this 19%. And these are people who are in the same churches, in the same communities, the same organizations, often the same families. And that's what this evangelical reckoning, such as it is right now, that it's so painful in so many cases, because even though like the needle isn't really shifting, right, in terms of the institutions and the leadership, very little movement there, but the agonizing within these organizations where people are just looking at each other across gulf that has become visible to them all of a sudden, just saying, who are you? What do you believe? What kind of God do you believe in? Right. And so I want to be able to not dismiss that still the spectrum that we have within white evangelicalism, but yes, having this tool, kind of diagnostic of white Christian nationalism is also very helpful, because that's where we can find a lot of white Christian nationalists who are not evangelicals, right? We have Catholic white Christian nationalists. We have secular white Christian nationalists, if you get into this kind of God and country faith, right? And that's important. So we need both terms, and we need to be very particular about how we're using them and how they interact.
Okay, we've got quite a few more questions here. I don't wish to rush you, but I just think they're good questions. Very quick one. I don't know if you can answer this quickly. It's a historical one. Can you address how the cross and the sword were married early in Christian history with the establishment of Christianity as a state religion under Constantine? Anybody? This is like University Challenge. Nobody's quite sure about the answer.
I think that's a Dr. Butler question.
I wondered. Do you want?
I didn't actually quite understand the question, so could you
Explain
say?
Constantine, and I mean, I'll just take this if you want it very quickly.
Came into being a kind of combined in Christian history. I'm sure it was to do with the Holy
Well,
War.
I'd respond to the historically. In some ways, both. How did Christianity prosper? It prospered, frankly, through its adoption in the Roman Empire. Without the adoption in the Roman Empire, it isn't really clear what would have happened to Christianity. It could have been one of many religions that failed in the 3rd century, the 4th century, the 6th century, the 10th century. We can't go back and repeat that. So we can't figure out, well, what really would have happened. But it certainly is true that the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire and the development of a gigantic, massive church, and if that also is true of a gigantic, massive Protestant Reformation, which then divided all kinds of things, we can't take those things back. But all of them in Protestant countries, the United States was one of the few countries in which there wasn't at least a formal relationship between organized religion and government. And we have to remember that before 1800, to be a dissenter and to be a heretic could cost you your life. And that life was not taken by a church, it was taken by the government. So we can't divorce those things. Now we're living in, where are we now? Well,
better not answer that one. It's too scary. Here's two very good short questions, and I wonder if Jemar, you might want to answer this. The book shows how successive popular visions of Christian masculinity have been used to advance a specific political ideology, especially in white evangelical circles. One, what is the right view that Christian men should have of themselves? And two, how has the Black view of Christian masculinity differed from the white view? Some of the voices in Black circles say the same things as the white ones, ?
Yes. So the right view, whatever Jesus did, is a good way to do it. I do think as we look at things like the fruit of the Spirit, which was mentioned earlier, what are the characteristics of all people, right? Love, joy, and peace, and patience, kindness, and gentleness, and self-control, and all of those things are good for men and women. But I think also we need to be aware that we live in a historically patriarchal society. And so then it comes down to, what does equity look like? How do men actively promote and make space in the world that has been taken up too often by men? How do we make sure that women can flourish and we don't get in the way of that? Those are the kinds of questions I think about and try to follow the example of others there. This issue of patriarchy and misogyny certainly doesn't stop with white men. The Black church has lots of issues around these types of problems, whether that is, sexual assault and sexual abuse in churches, whether that is relegating women to certain roles in the church. So yes, it certainly spans across traditions and across races for sure. I would simply say that particularly in the US context, this connection between patriarchy and misogyny and race has always been there as well. So, the plantation system was based on a patriarchal system and a paternalistic system where the plantation owner, the white male plantation owner, viewed himself as sort of the father figure, not only for his white biological family, but for the people he enslaved as well, and treated enslaved people as essentially perpetual children. And so taking this, I must be in control kind of role has long been there, and it's long fallen along racial lines. I think there's also historical racial trauma that Black people have taken on. And, the phrase is hurt people. And so to the extent that we see some of these same patterns within Black churches and Black communities, this is not to excuse it in any way, but to have experienced, Black men being quote unquote studs to impregnate Black women, to have seen Black women being wantonly raped in order to increase the enslaved population, having seen children ripped away from parents, all of that is going to have ongoing generational effects.
Okay, this is we've only got about 10 minutes left. Jude Nixon has said, Kristin or anybody else, I live in Boston, but my center-left Baptist church in Michigan actually changed its name to disassociate itself from evangelicals. Are any of you seeing similar moves?
Oh, absolutely. Kristin? Yeah, that's a trend, right? Because evangelical as a term, as Jemar's already suggested, it means different things in different global contexts. Although I would add that I'm also hearing from global Christians and global evangelicals from all sorts of different countries who are saying this particular strand of white evangelicalism has been exported and is taking hold globally and being put to political ends, often authoritarianism as well. And so that's another dynamic going on here. But yes, domestically here too, the term evangelical, right, it changes over time. I've actually done some linguistic studies of what the term meant and what other historians have talked about it in the 18th century, 19th century. And then you can just, I had a linguist kind of help me. And we saw how the term itself is morphing in real time, and particularly since the 1970s now. So there are different approaches you can take. Many evangelicals like to say, we're going to fight for that original meaning, whatever their ideal form of evangelical is. And it's always this theological construct, and it's always very much the kind of best face forward. For me as a cultural historian, right, that's not a game that I want to play. I want to look at what does evangelical mean in any given historical moment. And what does it mean to those who are practicing? And yes, what does this term mean? And we're seeing just again in the last 5 years, evangelicalism, the people who are identifying as evangelical are shifting according to how they understand the term. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, because now we have many people who are identifying with this conservative, right, patriarchal, Trump supporting, essentially white Republican ideal. That's what it means to them to be evangelicals. That's what they're identifying with. And so for other people who have long wanted to claim a different sense of evangelicalism, it's about a born again experience. It's about the authority of the scriptures, right? It's about acting out of your faith beliefs and stuff. I think many of them are just saying, we tried hard. It's not communicating anymore. And so we need a different label, because we don't want to send the message that we are this thing when we are actually something else entirely.
And I think it's important just to say, for folks, there's been this movement in the scholarship from very early on, when historians were writing about evangelicalism, it was a very sort of almost formulaic primarily theological description that they were putting forth, which almost invariably failed to capture really the dynamism and diversity of evangelicalism. And it's only recently, I think, in the past 10 years or so, and certainly the past several years with books like Jesus and John Wayne, that folks have said, you know what, checking these, theological boxes isn't really capturing what evangelicalism is and has been, particularly in the US. So let's do something like Dr. Du Mez does as a cultural historian. So what are they consuming? Who are they holding up as heroes? And how is that actually a more sort of broadly encompassing idea of what evangelical is and has meant, and as she stated, is constantly changing over time.
Well, I've got two more quick questions I want to get in. I don't know if we can answer both of them. One, somebody here has said, Christianity prospered during the 1920s and 30s with the advent and explosion of radio. Some preachers rose to fame, others were shut down. How did that decade shape evangelicals? Does country music and its stars have an impact in shaping some of the sexist, racist Christian history you're speaking about? Wow, that's a good question. Does anybody want to answer that? No?
I'll take a stab at that. And that is one of our problems is we generally think, if you listen to a general historical lecture, that religion failed in the 1920s and 30s after the scope trials. So, but we know better than that. That simply didn't happen. And there was a huge, the denominations, the Catholic Church and denomination really prospered in that period, despite the Depression, all kinds of problems with religion and the Depression. A lot of congregations did fail, but they also prospered. And so I think that it's one of the ways that we misunderstand our history, and therefore we misunderstand important elements of the way we became what we are.
Interesting.
I'll say this as well. It continues to confound me, and even more, how many people still overlook religion writ large as a massive force in history and particularly in politics, and then specifically evangelicalism, right? So back in the 70s, when Jimmy Carter came on the scene, journalists were like, what is this evangelicalism? What is this born again? Are there a lot of people out there who believe this stuff? And it's already this massive cultural and growing political force. And I'd say there's a similar dynamic happening even now. If you look at, the manufactured hysteria over something like critical race theory, it hit the political scene in the past year or two. But I would say those fault lines have been present within Christianity and particularly evangelicalism for years, if not decades before. And so we do ourselves a disservice as, engaged community members if we are overlooking the role of religion and then Christianity and evangelicalism, because a lot of these things have been present and are only just becoming, there are some people who are only just becoming aware because they haven't looked into these pockets of religion.
Interesting. Certainly the series on the Black church that PBS did was fascinating, about the parallel, development of civil rights and the Black church, and fascinating. So I hate to tell you, everybody, but we're getting very close to the end of our time. I know it's hard to believe because it's been so interesting. I'm sure you've just scratched the surface of a huge topic for people. And I think the book, and if they visit some of your sites and read some of your books, they'll be in for a treat, really, in terms of opening their eyes to the link between politics and religion in this country, which never seems to deviate too far from the other. Okay, so I'm going to thank you three historians, Kristin Du Mez, John Butler and Jemar Tisby for making the time. I thank you all. And to everybody who took the time to take part and listen. We had quite a lot of people, 160 people taking part in this. So Cambridge Forum is made possible by Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, the City of Cambridge, and you all.